Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to the editor of iMagazine, John L. Walters. I, of course, was founded in 1990 by Rick Poynter, who edited its first 24 issues. But in the magazine's almost 3 decades of publishing, I has only seen 3 editors. After Rick, Max Brunsma took over for 8 issues, and then John became the editor in 1999 and has been running the magazine ever since. But John's early career was actually as a musician. He toured England with his band Landscape before transitioning to a career in writing, where he's written for publications including The Guardian and the Architectural Review. In this episode, John and I talk about that background and how he started writing, and writing specifically about graphic design. We also talk about how design writing has changed over his nearly 20 years of running the magazine, and how I both needs to evolve with the times, but also stay true to its mission. And we talk about that mission and the role that he hopes I plays in that discourse, and what he looks for in new writers and new topics. This was so interesting to me. I obviously comes up in so many of these interviews and is truly a touchstone of graphic design writing and graphic design publishing, and is so clearly one of the most enduring magazines on graphic design. So it was a real treat for me to talk to John and talk about and all of these other subjects that we both love so much. So this is my conversation with I's editor, John L. Walters. I was kind of reading some interviews that you had done before, kind of reading some of your old pieces. And I think it's interesting that you actually come from a background in music, or started in music. And so I kind of want to start a little bit with that. You were a musician first.
Well, I went to college to read maths and physics.
Okay. So, I completely missed that.
So my first study was, when at school, I did art, I did music, I did photography, I did all kinds of stuff. But I was good at maths, and I wanted to go to London to hang out with jazz people. Basically, I wanted to go to London and become part of the jazz scene, and I found I could get a place at King's College London to read maths with physics. So that's what I did. So I spent quite a lot of my time as an undergraduate forming bands, going around trying to get people to play my music. And then when I left college, I went straight into music, playing on the London scene.
Okay. So you ended up never doing anything with math or physics?
When I was a penniless musician, I would make money by teaching numeracy classes. So I was teaching evening classes to people of all ages who couldn't add up a grocery bill, and it's actually really satisfying to help someone, because it's kind of it's not rocket science.
Yeah.
I mean, maths is also rocket science, but this is just adding up a grocery bill. So, and so I did a bit of teaching, but quite quickly I was able to start making money from music, either I formed a band called Landscape. We became very busy on the London scene. The indie sort of pre-punk and post-punk movement kind of took off. We formed our own label to record our music, so we made EPs of live gigs. I was also doing other stuff on the side, like arranging or playing sessions and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And my wife, Claire, who was in publishing, would occasionally get me to read manuscripts for a publisher. So my introduction to doing more writing-oriented things was through Claire.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that was you set up exactly what my next question was going to be, because the origins of this podcast really were that I was a practicing graphic designer, but always had an interest in design writing and wanted to kind of build a career that could include not just being a designer, but also writing about design. And so I was kind of curious, almost from your perspective, being a musician and then starting to write about music. Was that something that was happening simultaneously, or was that a kind of conscious decision?
Well, funnily enough, of course, when you're a musician, you're hugely sensitive to what people write
Right,
about you.
right.
And we did that classic thing. We were pretty kind of obscure, left field, very jazz-oriented band, and we had fantastic reviews. And once we had a pop hit, everyone hated us, so I got really bad reviews. And, But I was always interested in writing just on a kind of functional level, because when we did press releases and tour dates and stuff, we shared out all the duties. People looked after the expenses or sorted out the tour dates and things, and it would usually it'd fall to me to do the writing.
Okay.
So so after a while, and then maybe we'd do a TV show, and the person introducing us had no idea who they were, and they say, can you just give me something? And they say, John's the words guy.
Right.
So I would scribble something out so they could actually introduce us in a fairly intelligent way. So, and I remember doing a radio show with a very nice BBC producer, and it was, I think it was a weird program. Her idea was to do the New Yorker on British radio. It didn't quite take off. But it's a kind of mixture of conversation and music and all kinds of stuff. And one conversation I had with her just after that, she said, actually, you should really work on the writing. Just said, just write a few words a day. You should do that. And at the time, I thought that's a really weird thing to say, because I had no ambitions to be a writer. I was just someone who writing was just part of getting everything else done. Writing was part. To just get gigs, write to promoters, communicate, and needed to write. And of course, now I look back, it seems much simpler now than it even did 10 years ago, that I realise that was also my introduction to graphic design.
Okay, well, all right, I want to come back to that for a second, but I have a question about this person saying that you should work on the writing. How did you kind of receive that? What did you do with that? Did you start doing that, or how did you start? Where'd that transition happen, where you went from kind of thinking of yourself as a musician to perhaps thinking of yourself as a writer?
Well, that's a good question, because, she was a nice woman. She wasn't kind of saying your music sucks so much you should write.
Right.
Well, I don't think she was saying that. She was a nice kind of older American, kind of ballsy kind of woman. But she'd just tell people what was happening. And I think she liked my music. Maybe looking back, that's not so. But actually, I didn't know what to make of that. But it stuck in my head.
Okay.
When later I actually started making a living as a writer.
Yeah.
But no, I never had any major ambitions to write a short story or write a play or anything like that. But then again, when we got into making music videos, this was just before MTV, and these kind of story type videos were coming out. And of course, we made 4 videos, one of which had quite a lot of impact. And you start to get into writing treatments for that.
Right,
so you realise, this writing thing, it actually helps if you can spell, it helps if you understand grammar, it helps if other people can read what you do. And I remember someone once complimenting me on how nicely justified my TypeScript was.
Okay. So then, I guess now's the time to ask: is how do you transition then from writing about music? Because most of your early writing was about music, right?
It's not
it wasn't.
No,
okay.
In fact, when I transitioned, which is a word no one used in those days, but it's actually exactly what I did. After I had some success in the music business as an artist and writer, I became a record producer. So, So for most of the 80s, if someone asked me what I did, I'd say I'm a record producer.
Oh, okay.
Which of course covers million things, and it involves babysitting really badly behaved bands. It involves arranging for strings. It involves remixes. It involves hiring great session musicians or making really bad musicians sound a little bit better. There's a whole load of things that happen in record production, which is not that different to editing a magazine. I now know.
Right.
Plus, it was the early days of computers, so when I moved into writing, it was actually quite a short, sharp shock. It was quite sudden, right at the end of the 80s. And I had 2 kids, and my wife was a very successful, very experienced journalist, and she was getting offered lots of work.
Yeah.
And I was a record producer with a couple of hits, and nobody was calling. And I wasn't cool.
Interesting.
I wasn't interested.
Right.
I wasn't getting any work. And she said, "Well, you could do this," and she turned out to be correct.
And so then that was it, and then you just
I
started writing.
I started calling up. No, I didn't start writing.
Okay.
I started
or editing. Yeah.
I called up a whole bunch of magazines and newspapers saying, "Do you have freelance shifts?"
Okay.
And there's a thing which at that time there's a big freelance scene where you were needed because the newspapers are going through the night. There's the different editions. Right. Magazines were on quite small stuff, so they suddenly need extra people. They do a supplement, they need more people.
Yeah.
Same with designers, of course.
Right.
So I was on a scene that was similar to the scene that editorial designers were working on. And you go in, you have to be very nice to everyone. You hold people.
Yeah.
Whole subject matter of a magazine, whole set of people you know nothing about, but what they need is you to proofread, to copy edit, or sub-edit as we call it in the UK. Write captions, write headlines, that whole kind of thing. And Claire, my wife, gave me a kind of crash course in this is how you do this stuff.
Okay, yeah.
And then I also read, there's a whole bunch of very good books by Harold Evans.
Okay.
Who
the
is
name sounds familiar.
Married to Tina Brown.
Okay.
He was
That's
the
probably
editor
where
of the Sunday Times and then the Times, then came to the States, and he's a legend. He's a fantastic guy. His books, I would recommend to anyone writing in any genre, in any kind of area.
Okay.
Just how to write good copy. I don't know if I've actually, it shows in anything I do, but how to edit, how to handle copy, how to deal with layout, how to deal with the whole design process. Of course, the technology of the time he was writing about is totally gone now. It's the kind of technology you see if you see that Brian Levitt's film, Graphic Means.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know that? It's a kind of strange age where there was a transition between hot metal, cold metal, phototype, people using Letraset for zine, lots of different technologies, and digital was just kind of, everyone knew it was coming, but it was coming in a very kind of imprecise and vague way, and those early PageMaker programs were just so terrible. Now, I was a very inexperienced journalist, but because I'd been using computers in the music business, music was kind of ahead. If you think about it, music was way ahead of text handling and graphics, and the reason is because you don't need so much computer capacity to handle notes.
Oh, right.
Because what would happen is the synthesizer would play the note. You have a Moog synthesizer, you have a Juno 60 or something. So all the computer is doing is sending out tiny amounts of information. This is the pitch. This is the duration.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe this is the dynamic, but a lot of the time no one cared about dynamics either. So those early computers, you could save like a big 10-minute epic on a data cassette.
Oh, interesting.
And so we were using data cassettes before we used floppy disks, before we used hard disks and hard drives and things. So I was kind of a bit fearless with computers, but I was pretty ignorant. But then I looked kind of older, so I just bluffed my way into into these magazines. And I worked on every kind of magazine you can think of: car magazines, PR Week, tabloid newspapers, broadsheet newspapers.
So where did the design piece come in, or how did kind of writing about design or being in this graphic design world? How'd that all come together?
There's kind of two stories to do with like opportunities and also what I was interested in.
Okay.
And I realised now, just to throw back to when I was a musician, we really lucked in as a band because we mostly you go out on the road and the poster for your event is pretty terrible. Or you have to do it yourself. We would have like a sort of template, and then you just have to get a marker out and tonight, jazz punk tonight kind of thing. And we went to Camberwell College of Arts, which is now just down the road from where I live now. Played a gig, really nice gig. We had some big fans that used to come and see us at Ronnie Scott's. I said, come and play Camberwell. And there in the lobby was this beautiful 6-colour silk screen poster with a little beautiful line of sans serif type, and it was a kind of Japanese style. We were called landscape, but it was a Japanese landscape.
Oh,
and
interesting.
Like, wow, who is this?
Wow.
And they said, oh, that's John Morica. He's amazing. You've got to meet him. And so we became John Morica's first client when he was a student.
Okay.
Now, John is an amazing character. He he went on to work with a lot of music business clients. He formed a company. He worked for A&M Records. He formed a company called Dagama in the 80s.
Okay.
And then in the early 90s formed a collective called Tomato.
Oh, yeah.
And Tomato are kind of
I knew this sounded
about
familiar.
90s scene.
Yeah.
And so I've worked with, as a client with John on at least 3 projects, maybe more projects than that. And also, he's one of my oldest friends.
Okay.
And he now lives in Melbourne.
Okay.
And he teaches at Monash, and I imagine he's still being quite legendary over there. But we haven't seen each other for a while.
Oh wow!
So I realised that was an incredible stroke of luck that we got to work with a guy who was just a really influential graphic designer when he was a teenager.
Yeah. And then was that a thing? Was kind of what he was doing and kind of learning about design, was this all happening as you're touring and all of these things? Are you kind of picking up on this and realizing this is something that's interesting to you, or?
That's, I would love to say, we just hung out at the speakeasy chatting about graphic design, but no, it was basically, that's,
okay.
That's Led Zeppelin's roadie has just come down. That's like the highest we can get to celebrity at this club, But my main songwriting partner in landscape was another really interesting guy, Richard James Burgess, who now is the head of A2IM, which is the big lobbying group for independent music.
Okay, wow.
And we would use the it can be very boring going on the road with a band, and we just talk about all sorts of stuff. Mm-hmm. We were both reading Barth and Marshall McLuhan, and we talk a lot about communication. I don't think we even thought about design. I mean, I think when you're in a band, communication is something you sort of think, if only we could do this better.
Yeah.
And of course, having a kind of 5-piece democratic band is really difficult for making decisions and doing stuff. So I don't know if we were a great client.
Right.
But John did some fantastic work for us. He went to Birmingham. I think he did some very early stuff for Duran Duran.
Okay.
Our kind of our era. Then was also very interested in video. Very interested in what you could do on screen.
Interesting.
So there was a lot of discussions about this. And of course, this was far too early. When we did the sleeve notes for our most successful albums, we were saying, it's got to be computer graphics, and poor John, of course, the only thing you could do then was actually set the type, display it on a cathode ray terminal, cathode ray screen, which is curved.
Right.
Then you have to get a 35mm camera and photograph that screen.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So if you look at the type, I mean, it's kind of quaint now. It's really like an era, but all the type is photographed from the cathode ray screen.
Of course,
then when it was proofread and typos appear, you have to razor blade in corrections and things on film of cathode ray screen. So I guess in one sense, everybody knew that computers' digital type was going to come, but this was far too early to do that. It'd be much more sensible to use the technology that was actually working at that time.
So I'm going to ask a very kind of we're jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it's interesting. Because I'm curious how you ended up at I, how that.
Sorry, that's kind of the second half of this question. I realised from doing, as I told you, when I was sub-editing, doing lots of freelance work. What happens is after a while you realise, I really like working in this office, and I hate working in this office. You have to be nice and professional everywhere you go. But I just think, these are the nice people to hang out with. So I really enjoyed working on anything cultural. Mm-hmm. So I did a lot of work in the culture section of the Sunday Times. Editing the arts columnists. There's some fantastic writers then. There's a great columnist called Gilbert Adair, who was one of the first people to write really cogently about postmodernism. And he did a column every week, and I just see him on his desk in the far corner, just working away, and then the copy would turn up on this very ancient ATEX terminal, and we'd have to put a headline to it, and maybe cut one line. I mean, it was so well written, you really hated cutting anything. But so that was a great place to work. Nice, interesting people, and it was part of the whole sort of beast that was the Sunday Times. And then I left there because I got offered a contract on the Architectural Review. And I really like working on the Architectural Review. And I ended up doing 3 kind of maternity cover. Actually, you could say that in a way I owe my journalistic start to good maternity rights. Because the person I was replacing had a 6-month maternity leave. Maybe slightly more than 6 months, and then I came in just to do that, and it was being production editor. So it was a great job. I was working with really interesting writers from all over the world, architectural critics and writers. I really liked the editor, the deputy editor, the designer. The ad team, even the ad team, were really nice people. It was a good world to be in. And the same publisher published iMagazine.
Interesting.
So I got asked to apply for a job at iMagazine, and I applied, and I didn't get it. But that really, piqued my interest, because I knew this. It's kind of slightly mysterious magazine. No one ever came in the office. It was all done remotely.
Interesting.
Hardly ever got to see the people who worked on the magazine. It was Rick and Stephen and so on. And then a year went by, and the job came up. I was managing editor, and I applied, and I started working on iMagazine in 1997.
Wow. So I mean, now you've been there for 20 years.
Well, I've been editor since 1999. So it'll be 20 years next year.
So I'm curious, because obviously this kind of sets up a bunch of questions and things I want to talk about I specifically, because obviously I comes up in, nearly every interview that I do. It is the kind of magazine of design, we can call it design criticism or design discourse. And I came of design, or kind of started to become aware of design, when I was in high school in the early 2000s or so. From kind of seeing online design blogs, Design Observer, Speak Up, things like that. And was seeing these people talk about iMagazine, Immigrant Magazine, all of these places that were kind of really, as a kind of 13, 14, 15-year-old kid, I felt like I had missed all of this great kind of writing about design, and that was all kind of over. Of course, that was not true, but as someone who kind of didn't know anything about the field, I was seeing all these people talk about this stuff that was happening. And so I have a couple questions around this kind of idea. And the first one is I'm interested in how, from your position at how design writing or the discourse around design has changed over those 20 years, either kind of industry specific, but also culturally. And then the second part of the question is more specific, which is how the magazine has navigated those changes and been able to endure for this long.
Well, of course, it's very pleasing to us that we're still here.
And you should.
And a lot of magazines have gone by the wayside. And you understand why that's happening. And of course, people have been talking about the end of print for as long as I've been involved in journalism. And it's one of those things, a bit like the death of the symphony, the death of the end of the novel, the death of the novel. But of course, a lot of things that interest people, interest designers and writers are timeless.
Yeah.
What changes is that technology changes, the culture changes, but designers work within these various poles, these various kind of areas of interest, and they deal with them in new ways. And that's really what makes the topic, what makes editing eye such a treat. That things are constantly evolving and you're having to deal with them. And I also feel myself very lucky in editing a magazine for really quite an interesting readership. Most of our readers are like yourself, they're graphic designers, and they're graphic designers who are prepared to hand over their hard-earned cash to read a magazine and look at a magazine, enjoy a printed magazine that's about design and visual culture.
Yeah.
And my understanding of that readership is that they don't expect the new issue to be anything like the previous issue.
Right.
Now, if you think about it, a lot of magazines survive by being really quite similar from issue to issue.
Yeah.
Which is its own kind of... It can drive, it drives you crazy if you're actually working on one of those magazines because, it's like, we're going to do one of those kind of stories again, a triumph over tragedy. Or a how-to story,
Right.
Let's do a cool branding story again. It's kind of like everybody is doing the same kind of story over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And what we aim to do, I mean, maybe we don't always succeed, is to really keep reinventing the magazine with each issue. So, if you look at a few recent things that we've done, like the latest one is not themed. So it includes... I mean, I can always detect themes once I've done the issue.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, there's 3 male-female design duos in the latest issues. But that was never that was never an aim, but it's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then you might do another issue where there's a lot of illustration. That 93, 2 issues ago...
Oh, yeah.
We didn't call it an illustration issue, but it's very heavily dominated by illustration.
Right.
I-94, the type special we did. That's the one that had the 8,000 different digital printers.
Right. I remember that one. Yeah.
That's a type special. And we do a type special every 4 issues.
Okay.
And I have a sense that there are certain readers who only buy the type specials.
Yeah,
People they just love type. They love the adverts, which are all nearly all type foundries.
Yeah.
There are lots of news stories about type and type design and typography, and there are even more historical stories about type and typography.
I have a question. I don't fully know exactly how to phrase it, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate this the way I'm thinking about it, but it's interesting to hear you talk about how each issue is different, which I think is true. But I feel like at its core, is still the same magazine that it was probably when you started. It's still interested in the same things. It's still treating the topics with a certain level of depth and thoughtfulness that it always had. Like the editorial strategy, I guess you could say, is always the same.
I think that's absolutely right. The editorial shape of I was laid down very early by Rick Poynter and Stephen Coates.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Simon Esterson, who is both my business partner and the art director of I, unfortunately I haven't been able to meet him today. He was involved in the birth of I because he was one of the directors of the parent company.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
When you get round to interviewing Rick Poynter, he'll tell you a lot more detail about this. But there was a magazine launched in the 80s called Blueprint, which was a really it's a great architectural magazine, large format, really challenged. And interestingly, Simon is ex-Architectural Review as well.
Right. Oh yeah.
So Simon and Dejan Sujic and Philip Sayer, this little team of people created this fantastic architecture magazine in the 80s. And if you look at some of those early issues, they occasionally stray into graphics. And there's one in particular which I have a treasure at home, which is almost feels like a prototype for I. You've got articles by Richard Hollis, you've got articles by Robin Kinross, Rick Poynter.
Oh, interesting.
And I think it was edited by Rick, who was deputy editor of Blueprint. So there was kind of like the origins of the of the I approach was in that issue of Blueprint.
Yeah.
And I also feel if you trace the DNA of I further back, you get to the Architectural Review.
Yeah.
Where,
That's
when I worked at the Architectural Review, I think there'd only been like 5 editors ever since the Victorian, since the 1890s.
It's crazy.
A bit like the New Yorker used to be. It's just like very few people have done this. And so Simon was one of the people who actually signed off,
interesting.
The launch of I.
Yeah.
And I mean, just to have a little history about I magazine, because it's, I was really not involved for the first 7 years of its existence. But of course I know about it in retrospect, because also I'm with Sarah Snaith and I spend quite a lot of our time putting those old articles up on the website, because there's a lot of great stuff that no one can get unless you find an old issue on eBay. That seriousness was there right from issue 1 of I, where you have contemporary work, you have reviews, you have good, really in-depth criticism, and you're throwing a light on maybe some things that are not of the moment. They're not cool, but really, it seems like we should know about them. And the original Peter Murray, who was the publisher of, was the head of Word Search, the company that published I, had a vision of it being this great European magazine. And the original copies of I are in English, French, and German.
Oh, wow.
So the
I didn't know that.
First 6 issues were in 3 languages, and they did 2 issues just in English and German.
Okay.
And then they decided to just make the whole thing in English.
Oh, interesting.
And because, you're getting this secondhand, but my understanding was that although there was this original idea that this is a European magazine, the people who really loved talking about graphic design and writing about graphic design were all in the United States. So there's really early on you get Abbott Miller, Aaron Lupton, Jeffrey Keedy, all getting stuck in, those early articles. There was an American special issue, guest edited by Stephen Heller.
Right.
So by the time you get to the kind of the tens, the teens of I, there's a much stronger Anglo-American presence, both in writing and the subject matter.
Oh, that's so fascinating. This is kind of a big question. It might be, you might not actually be the best person to answer this question, but talking about that kind of really consistent editorial strategy that is traced back to the very beginning and has remained consistent, and talking about how all these other magazines, all these other publications have come and gone over the years, and just the evolution of publishing and the introduction of social media, and that we're hearing things like clickbait, and that there's this almost superficial kind of quality to so much writing now, and especially design writing, I think you could argue. How do you think, how does I both kind of resist that, but then also not just resist it, but live through it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to answer. I guess we just keep going.
Yeah.
It's like I often quote John White, the British classical composer, who I think who has a cult reputation in Germany.
Yeah,
there's a festival of his music. This guy's written like 400 symphonies or something. But no one knows who he is really. And someone said, Mr. White, how would you describe your position in the English music scene? And he said, well, I just work here. And we just fight the good fight. We just get in here. I guess there's a few answers to the questions you raised just now, which is that what you talk about clickbait and the superficial take on not just design but everything, culture in general, the news in general. That's always been there. It's nothing new.
Okay.
It's absolutely nothing new. There's always been bad or fast take or quick writing about everything.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that what you don't want to do is to drive out the opportunity to read the good stuff.
Right.
And it's a bit like fast food and slow food. And,
right.
I mean, and we all eat all that stuff. Sometimes you just need to grab a sandwich before you,
Right.
so you won't be late for your
Right.
appointment.
Right.
And I guess. I promised before we turned the microphone off, I was going to make a plea for new writers for I, and I think maybe this is my opportunity to do this.
Yeah, I thought so too.
I'd like to turn any kind of possible negativity into a positive, which is that I'm really always looking for new writers for I.
Yeah.
There is sometimes, we've mentioned some of the writers who have written regularly over the years, and you've interviewed some of them, like Alice Tremlow.
Yep.
Steve Heller, who has written for practically every issue of the magazine.
Right.
But I don't want there to be a perception from the potential buyers, or even a kind of a bias within the magazine, that this is the kind of the little in crowd clique that is writing, because there are lots of writers out there, and there are so many different kinds of writing that work within the context of I. Sometimes I meet people who kind of know I by reputation, but they haven't actually read very much, and their perception is it's all really intense critical discourse.
Right.
And of course, we have published some great things, and I'd recommend to anybody who wants to see really good contemporary criticism to read a couple of things by J.P. Hartnett.
Oh yeah.
Such as J.P. did a piece in I-91 about Swiss TED.
Oh yeah.
The Swiss TED phenomenon.
Yeah.
And then there's another new writer who's just come into the into the fold. I mean, there's no contract. People just write stuff. But there's Peter Buert, who is currently doing a lot of study into ethics and graphic design, and he writes great pieces. And so there is, really quite serious writing, and you have to sit down and think about it and look carefully. And some of those things are now online, so it's there for everyone to find. On the other hand, sometimes you just need a short 250-word or 400-word review of a new book, which we think is worth looking at, and it doesn't need a great long critique. Or maybe we don't have space. Maybe it would be nice to do that, but we don't have space. We want to get a really interesting diversity of material in the reviews section. Yeah. And so the reviews section is probably my favourite way to meet new writers. For example, sometimes someone will come to me with a really long essay, it's their college thesis or whatever, and I say, okay, well, that's great, but we don't publish 20,000 word pieces. But there's this new book about the same subject you just spent 3 years thinking about. Would you like to review this book for us? Right. And that might work out. It might not work out. It might feel, actually, I can't, it's not just writing, it's journalism. Yeah. And I think, writing at an academic level is a wonderful start for understanding the process of research. Yeah. And also for, you're being tested, you're being critiqued all the time about your ideas. But you're not often being tested in that academic context for journalistic clarity. Right. So we quite often find when people who've come from a purely academic background, it takes a while to kind of get into a different kind of rhythm, different kind of pace. Yeah. And interestingly, I won't mention names, but one young writer recently did their first piece for us on the first parts of copy editing, was really surprised by how much was changed and queried. And then I think there's a kind of click where she realised, I can see how this is working. And then we sent the page layout with the pictures and caption, because when you're writing for I, you're not just writing a sheet of on a sheet of A4 or whatever. You're writing something which is going to be part of an editorial design that incorporates pictures and headlines and all the things that go to make up a magazine. Yeah. And I think experienced writers and some new writers just get that. Right. Newer writers have to kind of think about how what they write would look in the context of I. Yeah. Of course, then the subject matter can send you in a completely different direction. So I might get someone who approaches me with a historical subject. Again, it's their main study or their enthusiasm. Yeah. And I'll say, well, okay, what about something that's by people your age? Right. And it's, okay, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. And, it's it's an interesting process because sometimes people come in by just submitting a blog post.
Yeah.
And we're not a very prolific blog. We do a few things. We don't have a budget to commission blogs, so they tend to be done by people in-house or very good friends or people have to have something that's a kind of byproduct, something they're doing for someone else.
What you're just talking about is something I was very curious about, in that design, and especially graphic design, has become this thing that kind of everybody knows about and kind of understands at a base level, and that there are now kind of these, a company will redesign their logo, or there'll be some sort of story that's about design, and the New York Times will cover it, or these kind of general publications will now cover these design stories. And I'm curious kind of if that's changed how you think about what goes in the magazine, knowing that even though there are less design publications, more people are talking about design, and that your audience is still designers, and it's always coming back to design readership.
Well, I think, we're an expensive magazine. It's a kind of investment. So it tends, I would say most of our readers are institutions and professionals. It's part of your studio, even if your studio is just you in one tiny room. Yeah. It's a kind of studio investment. And we also know, just anecdotally, that people go back to older issues, to research things, to go back to things that I've just heard about something that was in 5 issues ago. Mm-hmm. And people go back just to check out the type ads because they're looking for a new typeface to use. I know also that, if you like, this wider audience for design, they kind of maybe graze the website because we don't have a paywall. We make the older articles available on the whole. You don't get the same experience because you don't get Simon Esserson and Holly Kapfer's beautiful art direction. You're just getting the text and a few
template,
pictures. But when you get the magazine, you get a kind of a whole experience, it's a graphic design experience about the subject of graphic design. At the same time, I would say what Simon and Holly are particularly good about is not getting in the way of the design. That we have a very strict grid. There's a certain way we do things, and there's a certain structure of the magazine that makes it look like the magazine. But then within that, we have a lot of freedom to show things as diverse as R.O. Blackman, who's the cover star of the new issue, and talking about the Brazilian photographer João Farkas, which is a very visually led article. I would say I know that people do find things on the website because the website has a way of flattening out time, and people will find articles from the deep past, before my time, that suddenly seem relevant again, or they're incredibly quaint because they're so long time ago. And yesterday I had a very nice email from a student pointing out a mistake in the first paragraph. It was a repeated word in the first paragraph of an article from I-25. And I wrote back, and it was an academic address. So I wrote back, I say, are you a design teacher? And she said, oh no, I'm a student. I was checking out articles that were published in the year I was born.
Oh, wow.
And of course I'm very conscious that archive of going right back to November 1990, predates a lot of the new students by, it's a generation.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't even thought of that. Yeah, you're right.
So, and some of those articles, if you talk about Geoffrey Keedy or Robin Kinross, they stand up really well. So it's part of our, as I said, Sarah and I do put quite a bit of energy into bringing those articles out, and sometimes we respond to cues. People say, "Oh, I'm doing a thesis about Wolfgang Weingart, and I can't read your article, or I can't see, I can only see the first paragraph because we usually publish the first paragraph, nothing else, and then that we'll say, okay, we'll put that up the list of things to attend to and revive. So that's a kind of another little stream of activity going alongside. The other thing that I really love about what we do is that we can make references back to these early issues when we're doing something new. So, for example, there's a revived version of Design of Dissent by Mirko Ilic and Milton Glaser. And we did we featured that on our website, on our blog
Yeah.
recently, but we can refer back to the original review of the first edition by Sean O'Toole, and
Right.
Sean's original review still reads very well.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, politics has moved on a lot,
Right,
but
right.
there are certain points he makes that I think are worth reading. So
Yeah.
I'm very kind of glad that those things are there, and occasionally we'll hear from writers who, sorry, I'm getting a long way from your question,
No,
but
that's
we'll hear from, say, writers on more mainstream publications who are suddenly there's a fuss about a new logo or branding
interesting.
scheme, and they'll say, oh, the only things I can find are on the website.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're the expert, it's just that we're the only people who even published a 250 words thing on this. But I must say, although you're right, there is a kind of, new logos and things, new identities. To me, that's one of the least interesting subjects.
Oh, yeah. Me too.
Because
For me too.
To write about identity design after it's become established and it has a life, that's really interesting. So if you write about Romic Marber's for Penguin, which were like a really smart identity. It worked commercially, sales of the books went up, and it still works as really beautiful graphic design, 50 years after the time. And to go back to your question about there's a lot of quite shallow, superficial design coverage, I think that's really good because we don't have to do that.
Right.
It's like, it's a bit like back in the print days, there'd always be the trade, what they call the trades, which would be about so-and-so rolls out new branding scheme. Well, they wouldn't even call it branding. That rolls out new identity for X or Y. Or this agency has hired this hot young art director who's got a there's all sorts of kind of cliches of trade. I mean, the trade journals in the music business and the movies and so on. They work on a similar basis, and they have all the job adverts, and there's a whole way of doing things. And there's always new. I mean, graphic design is in such a state of churn. There's always such a lot of new things which are really interesting, and they're exciting, and they're cool, and you're really glad that people are fighting the fight and they're doing stuff. And it's not really our job, and we don't have the capacity. We don't have enough people to just do lots of little 100, 200 word articles about that every day. I can imagine an alternative universe in which I have a big staff with people down there. They're just kind of keeping the blog stoked, and we do the nice longer articles. But in fact, doing the kind of stuff we do really just takes all the time, and more than the time we have. In fact,
and I would argue that that's what people come to you for, and that if you did that other thing,
we probably wouldn't do it as well, and we'd miss something, And the other thing is that I'm really enjoying now is that some of the writers who started doing really quite quick and fast blog post stuff, they're just, it's like, that theory of the 10,000 hours? It was quoted in This Is Your Brain on Music. A fantastic book I recommend. About creativity and the way the mind works. I think if you've done lots of writing, even about anything, and to go back to my own kind of growth as a writer, I think, an editor, I think just doing probably about 8 years before I came to just working on every kind of magazine, from car magazines to food magazines to trade magazines, editing, writing, just doing anything, just writing and practicing your trade, just the way you practice an instrument or practice drawing, you become better. If you're lucky enough to have good subjects and you're smart enough to be critical, then it's better. But actually, just writing is really, really good. And I recommend anyone who aspires to be a writer, just start writing. Don't kind of think of yourself as a writer and then wait for that moment when you write your perfect article. Just start. Just do stuff. And so the nice thing now is that we have some of the newer writers who are coming in to do stuff. And I have worked for blogs like It's Nice That, ARGA, Ion Design, and Graphic, and print is now a blog, although I don't quite know what's happening there, but people do there are young writers who get excited by design and can find something to write about design, and will over that
Right.
over
Mm-hmm.
the act through the act of writing and reporting, you start to get a taste for what is it that you are really interested in.
Yeah.
So sometimes when I meet a writer, I'll say, I'll kind of read their stuff and so on, and I'll say, well, do you have a subject, or do you have something that really excites you, or that you think deserves more attention?
Yeah.
Not is this something I can pitch to someone?
Right.
Which obviously is a journalistic way of thinking.
Yeah.
But is it something that you have a real feeling you could write something about?
That leads perfectly into I have two more kind of semi-quick questions, but what you just said leads into a question that I kind of end most of the interviews with, which are, what are the topics or subjects that you're really interested in reading about right now, or what are the topics that you kind of want more of in I?
I want everything.
Okay.
I want everything, and I want all the stuff I've not even heard of.
Okay.
Because I do. There is that danger when you're established as an editor, and I've been around a long time, and iMagazine has been around a long time. There's a danger that people will just come to you with the thing you've just done, because they think, oh, that's what they like. And actually, I have an anecdote here which relates back to my the period between being a record producer and coming to I, which is in parallel with my early days in the cubicle, the sub-editing cubicles. I founded a music journal called Unknown Public.
Okay.
And that ran from the early 90s into the mid noughties.
Okay.
And it started as a CD journal with craft paper. The identity was by John Warwicker and Tomato and Graham Wood and Tracy Kesley and so on.
Yeah.
And the idea was it was a graphic artifact, and it had a CD or, amazingly, a cassette inside. And the idea was to try to bring back some of the materiality that you used to get in vinyl that people were kind of losing, missing. So you'd have posters, you'd have... and we'd also have... we would do, for example, a guitar issue. Which had a giant plectrum along with all the graphic stuff. And as soon as we'd done a guitar issue, everyone would send me guitar music. And that's the one thing I don't want.
Right.
Because we've just done that. I want to... In fact, we followed the guitar issue with the Netherlands connection, so it was kind of music that had a Dutch connection. And I think that's the same thing here. I don't want another R.O. Blackman type story. Even though I know there's some more out there that would be good, and we will do them in the future. But we don't want the next issue to have the same feel. If we do a photography feature like the Brazilian carnival masks, I don't want it to be like Brazilian carnival masks. I want it to have a completely different take. And so, in a way, I'm asking writers and friends and contributors and associates to think laterally, to think really differently. And of course, the reason I say that the reviews section is a really good way in is that there's always far more books to review than we have space for. And yet, I don't get sent the best books, So it's quite possible that there's a really fantastic book that is obviously right to be an I, that the PRs have forgotten to send me, the author... It doesn't even know we're still going. There's all sorts of weird things happening. And in a way, when I'm doing interviews like this, I'm putting out a plea to, send your design idea, your design exhibition that needs a review. Just tell us about the stuff that's happening, because we can't be everywhere. We can't have our antennas in every part of the world, and we are trying to be as international as possible. So, for example, we'd love to know more about what's happening in China. We don't have at the moment. We don't have someone who's travelling there or is based there who can do stuff. I've just today received a very nice article from Japan.
Oh wow!
So that's great, or a revision of an article from Japan. Actually, something I should say, perhaps to qualify my remark about the 10,000 hours, is that which I think is true if you really want to be serious about writing. But I don't mind publishing pieces in I that are by people who are not even writers. Because sometimes the person who writes the best article is not a great writer. They're the person who knows about it.
Yeah.
They're the person who has access to a great archive, or they're really good friends with the subject, and they can do an interview and they get stuff that like a really good journalist could go along and it wouldn't be interesting because they wouldn't have that intimacy.
Yeah.
So sometimes people, and I've seen this happen a few times that rather surprise people, they have one really good article in them, and they don't. It's hard work, you know. But, you know, they don't need to do another one. It's kind of like, I really wanted to get that particular thing into I, and and that's fine as well. And there's as I was saying, there's lots of very different kinds of articles that we publish, where you can have a 200-word caption review of an exhibition or a book. The reviews tend to be between 250 and 1,000 words. At the front of I, we have this front matter section with, for example, in the new issue, Sarah has written about Brian Levitt's film Graphic Means, but we've also had this piece by another new writer, a brand new writer to me, Anya Neinhardt, about
I don't know,
technology and publishing.
Oh, okay.
About the state of ebooks. Just that was prompted by a fairly obscure conference in Germany last year, and it just piqued our interest that this would be a nice thing to cover. In the last issue, we did a piece about plastics and recycling. So, we can go outside the remit of graphic design if it has a relevance to graphic design. So there's those kind of pieces which might be 800 to 1,500 words, which is a more discursive, critical, or analytical piece, and it doesn't need to have more than a few pictures. And then in the feature well, which goes in between those two sections, we have the really long, meaty, typical I articles, which is where you've got Eileen Kwan doing a profile of Triborough, or my interview with Romick Marber, and those articles they can be storied, they can have sidebars and extra sections, so that we're kind of putting together there may be more than one writer involved, so you get a different perspective. The great Paul Stiff, who wrote several fantastic, late Paul Stiff, unfortunately, wrote several articles in the early days of I, and a couple of things for me not long before he died. But Paul, who taught at Reading University for a long time, talked about this concept of useful writing. And I think this is quite an interesting idea if you're a designer or you come from a design background. That sometimes, just like laying out a page or doing a poster, sometimes you just have to be useful. Right. If you have a visual style or a writing style, it will maybe come in around the edges, but you just have to get those useful facts down. Tell it like it is. What are we looking at? Who is this person? Right. What year is it? What's the context? Who's the client? There's a certain amount of material which is actually really just very traditional journalism, just being useful. You have useful writing in museum guides and timetables and all that kind of thing. It can be very, very straightforward. But and one thing I sometimes say when I talk to students about writing is, think about giving instructions for someone how to get to your house. If you had to write that down, you have to be really clear. Sometimes maybe a map is better, a little diagram, but maybe you can't do that because you're sending a text. It's something that the really most trivial bit of writing, there is an opportunity to hone your writing skills.
Exactly. I think that's a perfect way to actually wrap this up. Thank you so much for doing this. Obviously, I'm a big fan of what you're doing, and I'm glad that we got to do this. I thought this was such a great conversation, so thanks.
Jared, thank you for the opportunity to talk about writing and
writing
about design and editing, writing about design. It's as you can tell, it's what I do, it's what I love doing, and it's always changing.
This episode was recorded on February 2nd, 2018 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.